The war may have paused, but the most dangerous part may be starting now. Washington says it won. Tehran looks battered. Yet the real pressure point is no longer the airstrikes or the missiles. It is the narrow stretch of water that can shake global energy markets in a matter of hours. Why does a ceasefire still feel like the opening move of a bigger confrontation? Why does Iran, even after heavy damage, still hold a lever powerful enough to keep the region on edge? And why is the United States already pouring more money into weapons, missiles, drones, and future combat systems while the smoke has barely cleared? To understand what happens next, we need to look past the headlines and into the logic of power that is forming right now. Here is the situation as it stands now. A 2-week ceasefire has paused a 38-day U.S.-Iran war that pushed the Gulf close to a wider regional breakdown, but the pause is fragile and highly conditional. Washington says it inflicted decisive damage on Iran's air defenses, weapons production, and naval assets, while also making clear that U.S. forces are ready to resume operations if diplomacy collapses. Tehran, for its part, is entering talks with deep mistrust and is signaling that any return to normal movement through the Strait of Hormuz will remain tied to military coordination and new restrictions during the truce. That is why this story matters far beyond the battlefield. The conflict has already shaken shipping, energy flows, and confidence across the Gulf. And even after the ceasefire, major commercial actors like Maersk still say there is no full maritime certainty in Hormuz. At the same time, the United States is not behaving like a power that believes the crisis is fully over. Defense officials say American forces will remain in the region, while new budget plans point to an even larger push into missiles, future combat systems, and long-term military readiness. So, the background to this story is not peace after war. It is a tense interval in which both sides are testing whether negotiations can hold before pressure returns to the sea lanes, the oil market, and the wider regional balance. Here is the situation as it stands now. A 2-week ceasefire has paused a 38-day U.S.-Iran war that pushed the Gulf close to a wider regional breakdown, but the pause is fragile and highly conditional. Washington says it inflicted decisive damage on Iran's air defenses, weapons production, and naval assets, while also making clear that U.S. forces are ready to resume operations if diplomacy collapses. Tehran, for its part, is entering talks with deep mistrust and is signaling that any return to normal movement through the Strait of Hormuz will remain tied to military coordination and new restrictions during the truce. That is why this story matters far beyond the battlefield. The conflict has already shaken shipping, energy flows, and confidence across the Gulf. And even after the ceasefire, major commercial actors like Maersk still say there is no full maritime certainty in Hormuz. At the same time, the United States is not behaving like a power that believes the crisis is fully over. Defense officials say American forces will remain in the region, while new budget plans point to an even larger push into missiles, future combat systems, and long-term military readiness. So, the background to this story is not peace after war. It is a tense interval in which both sides are testing whether negotiations can hold before pressure returns to the sea lanes, the oil market, and the wider regional balance. The ceasefire has also triggered a second layer of movement, and this layer is political, commercial, and regional all at once. Iran is entering the next round of talks with open caution, not trust. Its ambassador in Geneva told Reuters that Tehran sees the pause as a test of American intentions, while keeping military vigilance in place and insisting that passage through Hormuz will remain under tighter coordination during the truce. On the other side, Washington is treating diplomacy as a narrow opportunity, not a strategic reset. U.S. military leaders say they are fully prepared to resume combat if the talks fail, which means the negotiations are unfolding under the shadow of immediate force, not under the protection of stable peace. That tension is already spreading beyond the two main capitals. The European Union has welcomed the ceasefire and is urging all sides to turn it into a lasting agreement, while the United Nations has sent its envoy to support a more durable end to the conflict and to reinforce the need for freedom of maritime movement. Israel has publicly backed the 2-week pause, but with an important limitation. Its government says the arrangement does not apply to Lebanon, which means one of the region's most dangerous spillover fronts remains exposed even while the U.S. Iran track moves into talks. In practical terms, that keeps the wider war architecture alive. One channel has paused, but the broader network of escalation has not fully shut down. The commercial consequences show why this matters so much. Shipping companies are not reacting as if a normal peace has returned. Maersk says the ceasefire may create transit opportunities, but still does not provide full maritime certainty. Hapag-Lloyd says that even if the region stabilizes, it could take 6 to 8 weeks for shipping patterns to normalize. Meanwhile, shippers are still seeking basic clarity on whether Hormuz is truly reopening or merely being managed through selective permissions under Iranian control. That uncertainty affects not just tankers, but insurance costs, routing decisions, fuel markets, and the confidence of every state that depends on Gulf energy flows. So the story's moving forward in a very specific way. The shooting has slowed, but the leverage is now spreading into diplomacy, maritime law, allied coordination, and the economics of global trade. What is happening here is not just the aftermath of a war. It is a struggle over what counts as victory. Washington is presenting the ceasefire as proof that overwhelming force worked, pointing to extensive strikes on Iranian military infrastructure and warning that operations can resume if diplomacy fails. Tehran is answering with a different logic. It may have taken serious damage, but it still holds influence over the one geographic choke point that matters most right now, the Strait of Hormuz. That is why the ceasefire feels unstable by design. The United States wants to convert battlefield pressure into political concessions. Iran wants to convert geographic leverage into negotiating space, security guarantees, and strategic relevance even after absorbing military losses. The deeper reason this happened is that modern conflict in the Gulf is no longer decided only by destroying targets. It is decided by controlling flows. Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of global oil and LNG trade, which means Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional sense to shape the next phase. It only needs to keep uncertainty alive long enough to raise shipping costs, delay commercial normalization, and remind every outside power that military success on land or in the air does not automatically produce stability at sea. That is exactly what we are seeing now. Maersk says the ceasefire creates opportunities, but not full maritime certainty. Hapag-Lloyd says even under better conditions, recovery will take 6 to 8 weeks. In strategic terms, that means Iran is using disruption itself as leverage. This also explains why the United States is already looking beyond the ceasefire. The war exposed a familiar problem. Even if U.S. forces can strike harder and faster, the region can still be thrown off balance by maritime fragility, proxy risks, and the cost of keeping forces deployed for long periods. That helps explain the push into larger defense budgets, missiles, and future systems. The lesson Washington appears to be drawing is that deterrence in the next phase will depend not only on punishment, but on endurance, surveillance, and the ability to stay present across multiple theaters at once. So the real meaning of this crisis is larger than one truce. It shows that in the Gulf, the decisive contest is not just who can hit hardest, but who can shape the space after the shooting stops. The next variable is simple, but extremely dangerous. Can this ceasefire survive first contact with reality? The truce lasts only 2 weeks. Iran says it will approach talks with deep caution, and U.S. officials are openly signaling that combat can resume if negotiations fail. That means every day of the ceasefire is now a test, not just of diplomacy, but of discipline. If a single tanker is challenged, if a naval warning turns into a direct incident, or if one side decides the other is exploiting the pause, the entire framework could break faster than it was built. The second variable is Hormuz itself. Shipping companies are still acting as if the danger has only been reduced, not removed. Maersk says the ceasefire creates possible transit opportunities, but not full maritime certainty. Reuters also reports that shippers are still seeking clarity on the exact terms of passage, while Hapag-Lloyd estimates that even if stability returns, normal operations could still take 6 to 8 weeks. That matters because the strait is not just a route. It is the pressure gauge of the whole crisis. If traffic resumes smoothly, the ceasefire gains credibility. If transit remains selective, delayed, or politically conditioned, then Iran keeps the initiative and the region stays one shock away from another escalation. The final variable is spillover. The United Nations is pushing for a durable end to the conflict and freedom of maritime movement, but the wider region is still fragile. So the biggest question now is not whether the shooting has stopped. It is whether this pause can stop the next chain reaction before the Gulf is pulled back into crisis. The core of this story is now impossible to miss. The guns may have gone quieter, but the real contest was never only about who could strike harder. It was about who could control what came next. The United States says it proved military dominance. Iran is trying to prove that even after major losses, it can still shape the region through the Strait of Hormuz, the flow of shipping, and the pace of diplomacy. That is why this ceasefire matters, and why it still feels unstable. If the talks hold and maritime traffic normalizes, the crisis may begin to cool. If they fail, the same choke point that paused the war could become the trigger for its return. In the Gulf, power is not measured only by destruction. It is measured by who still holds leverage after the smoke clears.